My name is Ben Abelow, or Benjamin Abelow. I'm the author of a new book titled How the West Brought War to Ukraine. And I'll just read the subtitle because that will give you more of a sense of what the book is about. Understanding how U.S. and NATO policies led to crisis, war, and the risk of nuclear catastrophe. And basically in this book I lay out an argument that's quite different and runs counter to the story, to the narrative that's presented by most of the Western media, by Washington, by the European capitals. I want to make just a couple of points in this short video. I have a chapter in my book called Putting the Shoe on the Other Foot. And I want to just, a central background to this is the question of NATO expansion and more generally the expansion of Western military forces to and then toward Russia's border. Now, it's a whole story that goes behind that, and in fact the West made assurances to Moscow, and this is documented you can find the documentation at the National Security Archive of George Washington University. I suggest you take a look, if you're interested in this, in an article in International Security by a researcher named Joshua Shifrinson. They basically make quite clear that the Western powers had given assurances to Moscow at the end of the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand towards Russia's borders further than West Germany. But in fact, NATO did expand 1,000 miles right to Russia's border. Any case, I'm going to set aside that history and not focus on that. I've spoken about that elsewhere. And just ask a general question of how would the U.S. respond if Russia or China had sort of done the equivalent to what the U.S. and the NATO powers have done with respect to Russia. How would the U.S. respond if the shoe were on the other foot? Of course, it's complicated. Can one make a complete point-by-point comparison? Obviously, we have oceans to protect us. Russia is, of course, much closer to Western Europe. So you can't make a 100% comparison, but I think it's still very instructive. How would the U.S. respond if Russia had, let's say, formed an alliance with Canada, established a friendly relationship, and then started arming Canada right on the U.S. border from within Canada, and then undertook military training exercises that were designed to attack targets inside the United States? This may sound extreme to you, but let me give an example of what I'm talking about. Estonia, which is right on Russia's border, one of the territories that assurances were given that NATO would not expand to Russia's border, in 2020 and 2021, NATO carried out a series of rocket exercises inside Estonia. And in 2021, they did a series of 24 live-fire rocket exercises using tactical rockets with a range of about 190 miles. Now, these exercises took place 70 miles from Russia's border, and the exercises were designed to simulate attack on air defense systems inside Russia. So we're really talking about simulated attacks on defensive outposts within Russia proper on a territory that's right on Russia's border, carried out by Western powers. Now, I'm not saying that NATO was actually intending to plan an assault within Russia. In fact, I think that the actual motivation was, how would we respond if there was a Russian invasion of Europe? In what ways could we destroy some forces that, while ostensibly defensive, could actually be part of a broader offensive campaign? But one still has to look at the actual reality. And let's bring this back to on the other foot. How would the U.S. respond if, regardless what Russia's stated intentions were, Russia might say, look, we are a defensive alliance with Canada. We are not intending to attack. We are really just trying to have a protective step. But this is not how military and political leaders, and it's not how ordinary citizens think. What they really do is they have a prudent, skeptical attitude towards the stated intentions, and they look instead at the military hardware and the locations of the hardware and the nature of the training exercises, and they look at the force capacities, and then they make a judgment. And I think it's almost a foregone conclusion that if Russia were to do something like this on the U.S. border, the U.S. would, at every level, go bonkers. The military would go bonkers. The politicians would feel this as a vast threat. Ordinary American citizens would feel it as a tremendous threat. And it might well be that the U.S. would actually launch a preemptive attack on those rocket launchers inside Canada. They would certainly demand that the rocket launchers be removed and that the forces be removed altogether. And if they didn't do that, then there might well have been a preemptive attack on those rocket launchers. And there might have well been an escalation that could lead to global nuclear war. So what I'm trying to argue here is not that one has to be fully accepting of everything Russia says, and not that one has to be denying the possibility that the U.S. might have benign intentions, but one has to look honestly and critically at how we in the U.S. would feel at the level of military, at the level of political, and at the level of ordinary citizens if something equivalent happened. And then one must be willing to sort of take a kind of psychological step, a kind of, walking a mile in the other person's shoes, and ask the question, how would prudent Russian military planners and political planners, and even ordinary citizens, react in a circumstance like that? And I think this lays an important foundation in understanding a plausible argument that what took place in Ukraine was not motivated by the usual story that's being told of an expansionist, violent, Hitler-like Putin, but may well have had to do with a great fear that Russia had of U.S. military encroachment right on its border. And as I've said before, one also has to keep in mind a deep history of invasion of Russia by the West. Just to repeat something again, during World War II, when the Nazis invaded Russia, 1 in every 7 Russian citizens, I'm not talking about 1 in every 7 members of the military, I'm talking about 1 in 7 of the entire Russian population died during that invasion. That is a level of death that we here in the U.S. can barely begin to imagine. And when one puts that together with the movement of Western forces to Russia's border, which has been occurring for 2.5 decades now, puts that together with rocket exercises, live fire rocket exercises taking place right on Russia's border, directed to destroy defensive targets within Russia, whatever the U.S. motivations were, one starts to begin to create a scenario and an image and an understanding of how the simple story of Western good and Russian evil might become much more complicated. I'm going to speak just very briefly now before stopping about a few books that people might want to read if they want to try to understand more deeply what's happening here. First, I'll just mention my own book, How the West Brought War to Ukraine. You can get this through independent bookstores. They may have to order it. You can get it through Amazon. It's available in ebook as well as a print copy. And within a few weeks, there'll be an audible version as well. Next, I want to recommend a book by a late brilliant scholar, Stephen F. Cohn, professor emeritus at Princeton University and also New York University. This is a book called War with Russia, ? This is a series of very short, readable pieces by Stephen F. Cohn. And one of the wonderful things about this book, if you buy the latest edition, it's a memorial edition that includes, in addition to the material that Stephen F. Cohn himself wrote before he died, there's a few dozen pages at the beginning that's kind of talking about Stephen Cohn and talking about the man. And one of the things that I love to think about with Stephen Cohn is he was no pushover. This is a man who in the 1970s was smuggling copies of Solzhenitsyn into Russia. And one can imagine what kind of risks the person undertook doing that. So this is a man who has had deep contacts with Russia since the 70s, person of guts and integrity, and a person of deep erudition, who unfortunately he's not alive now, but we do have this and other books that he's written that offer a kind of counter-narrative to some of the stories that we're being told now. I also want to mention 2 more books. There's a whole question of what has motivated U.S. actions and NATO actions, and there's the whole question of the military-industrial complex. This is a term that was coined by General Eisenhower, a great hero of World War II, a 5-star general, U.S. president, in his farewell speech as U.S. President, his last televised address, he warned the nation about the dangers of the quote-unquote military-industrial complex, this confluence of military bureaucratic power and the financial interest of the arms industry. It's a very hard concept to get your heads around. How does that fit together? How could that have actually occurred? And I think a very good place for someone who might want to start considering what is that actually about and how might that have influenced the policies that contributed to this war in Ukraine. I want to recommend this book called The War State by Michael Swanson. And one other book I'll just mention, I don't have a copy here, about a military-industrial complex, a book by Andrew Cockburn called The Spoils of War. And you might just want to read the first couple of chapters of that book. Finally, I'll say something that is, quite touchy-feely for a subject like, a deep sort of hard-headed historical, military, arms control, political interaction subject like this. People who do this kind of do bean counting. How many nuclear weapons? I want to end on a sort of a much more human note. There's a book called Nonviolent Communication that I think has great implications not only for our own selves and our personal lives, but deeply for the relationships between countries. And I do believe that if the leaders of countries would read and absorb this book, I don't have a Panglossian notion that all the problems would evaporate. I think that's fanciful. But I think it might provide an additional way of thinking, an additional set of tools that could be used to try to de-escalate conflicts before they become terrible, violent, destructive wars like we're now witnessing. Wars that cause tremendous death and destruction on both sides.